thank you for taking the time today to join Krypton's Knowledge Series, which is a platform for open discussion on market trends. As a professional services firm, Krypton aims to bring you knowledge and insight to help you understand and educate yourself on these topics. We bring together today's leading business minds to share their insights on key markets. Follow us on LinkedIn to be updated on our next and upcoming webinars. My name is Roderick White. I'm CEO of Krypton Fund Services, and I have the privilege today of moderating today's webinar on Singapore's variable capital company, 6 months into VCC. With the introduction of the variable capital company, Singapore has captured global interest in elevating its position and becoming a prominent option as a fund's jurisdiction in the asset management market. Herein and throughout the remainder of the webinar, we'll be referring to the variable capital company structure as VCC. At this time, I'd like to give each of our panelists an opportunity to provide a quick introduction. Martin, can I get you to start, please?
Yeah, thank you, Rod. My name is Martin O'Regan. I'm the principal at a company called Solas Fiduciary Services. We provide independent directorship vehicles to fund vehicles, investment vehicles, and holding companies. And we're already active on some VCC funds at the moment, Rod, providing independent directorships.
Perfect. Thank you, Martin. Brandon, can I have you give a quick overview, please?
Hi everyone. My name is Brandon. I'm the head of corporate law practice at WMH Law Corporation. We're a fairly young law firm. As head of the corporate practice, my specialization, or we try to focus at least on the investment fund space, being at the apex of the ecosystem and everything that's downstream, like the IPOs, the M&As, and stuff like that. We've been quite privileged to have participated in the pilot for the VCC. And since then, we've also been involved in almost 8 to 10 VCCs as well. So have quite a fair bit of experience in that space, and probably take the forum today or the platform today to share our experience so far.
Perfect. Thank you, Brandon. Sean, can I get you to give a quick overview of yourself and your firm?
Sure. Thanks, Rod. So I'm Sean. Hi, everyone. I'm a VP from Raffles Family Office. So we are a multi-family office, and of course, the VCC has been of great interest to us, helping our clients to structure and to plan their wealth. So I think this forum would give us a good opportunity to share our experience, which we have in the past 6 months dealing with the VCC. Probably we have about 4 or 5 funds in the pipeline, and of course we're still learning as the VCC is still a very new framework to all of us. So happy to discuss and to share my points on the VCC with all you guys.
Perfect. Thank you, Sean. And finally, we have Alan Wu, who runs our Singapore office for Krypton and was instrumental in putting together today's webinar. Alan, can you give a quick overview?
Yep, sure. Thanks, Rod. So my name is Alan, and I'm head of operations in the Singapore office in Krypton Fund Services. So so thanks for everyone for joining the webinar, and we look forward to learning with everyone, as well as our esteemed panel sharing their thoughts and knowledge on the VCC. So feel free to send in your questions, and we will answer them at the end of the webinar. So that's it for me, and thanks, Rod, again for taking the time to host this as well.
Perfect. Thank you, Alan. And if we can just flip to the next slide, what we'll do is just give a high-level overview of basically the topics that we'll cover today. And looking at the agenda for today's webinar, what we'll do is give a recap and overview of the VCC. We will talk about redomiciliation, which is a topic that's come up a number of times in operational matters. We'll look at the VCC grant scheme, which is definitely important and I guess on the top of everyone's mind. We'll look at the uses of the VCC structure. We'll talk about corporate governance. Another operational matter, looking at performance fees and equalization versus series accounting, AML, CTF. We may touch on tax incentives and most importantly, market and distribution and what we're seeing in the market. Lastly, if there's any time, we'll open up the call for questions. However, any questions that are not answered, don't worry. We'll summarize those and put those in a document, which we'll follow up by email a couple days following the webinar. To start things off, I thought what made sense is we'll give an overview and a recap for parties on the call which are new to Singapore's VCC. Can I ask Alan to give a quick overview, I guess, and a recap of the VCC and just a high-level overview?
Absolutely, Rod. So the variable capital company, or is all commonly known as the VCC, is a relatively new corporate structure designed specifically for collective investment schemes. Launched on 15 January 2020, which coincidentally is exactly 6 months ago, the VCC offers more operationally flexibility for fund managers in Singapore to domicile their investment funds in Singapore itself. Prior to the VCC, Singapore fund managers have used unit trust, private limited, and the limited partnership structure to house their strategies onshore, which all has its own pros and cons. The VCC is set up to eliminate the disadvantages of each of the prior structures, which makes the VCC a very attractive and efficient structure for collective investment schemes. To provide some insights on key features and pros of the VCC, Singapore fund managers now have a structure whereby they are able to issue and redeem shares without approval of shareholders, distribute dividends out of the VCC's capital, something that the private limited regime does not allow, access the numerous tax treaties that Singapore has in place, which is something that the limited partnership structure does not allow as well. It also allows for the inward redomiciliation of offshore funds, as well as allowing the VCC to set up both standalone and umbrella structure, which gives fund managers the flexibility to set up multiple strategies under umbrella structure, at the same time segregating the assets and liability on a sub-fund level. The VCC also looks to build its ecosystem in Singapore with the requirement of local service providers to be appointed. For example, a VCC can only be set up if there is a Singapore permissible fund manager, appoint a Singapore-based corporate secretary, have at least one resident director, and have its books audited by a Singapore-based auditor. And if applying for the tax incentives such as the 13R and 13X offered to investment funds, it will have the need to appoint a Singapore-based fund administrator as well. Today, 6 months after the launch of the VCC, despite the effect of COVID-19 on the economy, we have 86 VCCs incorporated as of yesterday, with a wide spectrum of strategies ranging from traditional long-short funds to private equity and real estate, venture capital, and of course, fintech. So that's the summary of VCC. And Rod, back to you.
Perfect, Alan. Thank you for the summary. And actually, I guess that's quite impressive when we look at the fact that in a short period of time, Singapore's got such great traction with 86 VCCs already incorporated and structured. So I got to applaud the industry for the great success on that matter. And looking at that, I guess, and one of the topics that quite commonly come up in operations is, is it possible to redomicile a structure basically from another existing fund jurisdiction or another country into the Singapore VCC? So I guess, Brandon, if I can get you to give me an overview of key topics to consider in regards to redomiciliation. I'm sure it's a topic that basically other parts of our panel would want to jump in on, because I don't think there is one right answer in terms of what makes sense for all managers. So Brandon, I'll hand it over to you in just in regard to redomiciliation.
Yeah, sure. I think in terms of the requirements for redomiciliation, there isn't a lot of prescriptive requirements. The main one being that the fund has to be solvent, right? And I think that there aren't that many other prescribed sort of minimum requirements under the relevant regulations. But ACRA will not approve a redom application if a couple of things, right? The first is if the fund manager that's going to be the proposed fund manager to the VCC does not satisfy the regulated fund manager requirement. I think that's a given. Second one is if none of the proposed directors of the VCC is also simultaneously a qualified representative of the proposed fund manager. That's also a requirement for new VCCs anyway. The third one is more like a policy sort of high level kind of consideration, is that if the proposed VCC is going to be used or likely to be used for an unlawful purpose or for purposes which are sort of like prejudicial to public peace, welfare, and those kind of stuff in Singapore, then that's a reason or basis for the rejection. And the last one is the standard sort of high level national interest, national security sort of reasons. Can't imagine what that might be, but yeah, that's one of the bases for rejection. I think in terms of the 86 VCCs that we've seen in the market today, not many of those are actually the product of redomiciliation. I think there are a couple of reasons, and I think in terms of the redom versus actually setting up a new VCC, the primary part of the key part of the whole process is the part where we need the approval or the cooperation of the corresponding jurisdiction. So if you have a redomiciliation from Cayman, for example, to Singapore, I think a lot of it depends on, or rather the duration of the whole process, a lot of it depends on CIMA, right? Because they need to give the approval, and how long they take to come up with that approval, we don't have control over that. So I think a lot of times, if in terms of a delay in the process, that would probably be at the end of the counterparty jurisdiction. And I would imagine, presumably, that if you have various or differing jurisdictions like Mauritius and Cayman would have different processes and therefore sort of different types of timelines, and different experiences. I think there's also a couple of things that people might want to consider in weighing the options between a newly formed VCC versus a redomiciliation. I think for liquid funds, if you do want to do it fairly quickly, it may be better to just set up a new VCC. For liquid funds, I think I would think that it would be a lot more effective if you just had gotten some sort of power of attorney from your investors to allow you to redeem and subscribe into the shares of the VCC on their behalf. But obviously you have to liquidate all your positions first. That is one option. But of course, if you're a fund with like 1,000 investors, that may not be too practical. And then for the more close-ended guys, I think the considerations could differ. So for example, if you're a real estate fund or if you're a venture capital or private equity fund, I think the considerations are more things like whether there's any stamp duty implications in doing we call it a subscription in kind into the VCC, where the assets are transferred over and shares are issued to the existing investors in, let's say, the Cayman structure. And that's a subscription in kind. But the transfer of the asset from the Cayman structure to the VCC could attract certain stamp duty, sort of depending on which jurisdiction you're in. So that's one consideration. And I think also, we haven't experienced a lot other than just Cayman redoms. So I think if anyone on this panel or even in the audience have any experience with other jurisdictions like Mauritius, feel free to share your experience with us, because I think this is a fairly new structure. We've only been into 6 months into the VCC, so I think a lot of it we're still also trying to figure out as we go along.
Perfect, thank you, Brandon, for that. Anyone else have any insights on that? Because I know my personal views are, is never a straightforward answer in regards to basically redomiciliation. There's a lot of considerations and a lot of advice that has to be sought in regards to the fund structure in terms of basically making sure that all considerations are taking place, not only the number of investors, taxation, speed, people look at it as an operational efficiency. However, a lot of times there's probably more paperwork in a redomiciliation because everything has to be repapered the same way as with a new structure. So anyone else have any thoughts in regards to redomiciliation, if we've seen any, if we expect to see any?
Yeah, Rod, I had some experience with that with a client who's a Swiss manager and was having difficulty distributing Cayman products in Switzerland on his platform. So he was quite enthusiastic about the VCC. So the first fund he moved across, he did a redomiciliation, and it's still haven't got the clearance from SEMA yet, and that's sort of 3 months in. So he's actually launched a second VCC in the meantime by shutting down. So his second VCC, he actually wound down the Cayman vehicle and started a brand new VCC, and that's already up and running now. So I agree with what a lot of Brandon said is, I think everybody was very enthusiastic about the redomiciliation process, but I think practically, if you are bringing investors across, I think people will underestimate the amount of time that it takes to get them across from Cayman. So I think what we're going to do now with this client is wind down the Cayman vehicles and start fresh VCCs. And as Brandon said, these are listed equities, so it's much easier. With private equity, it's not always easy to change title, depending on the jurisdiction of the underlying asset. And it could trigger a tax event also. So yeah, so that's my experience with it so far.
Okay, perfect. And I guess the same can be echoed into the real estate market as well, in regards to basically it's not just cut and dry in regards to basically transferring an asset over to a new structure, because that could have some taxation impacts.
Yeah.
Perfect. Well, thank you for your views on that. I guess the most important question, I guess what most people get excited about, or the most questions that we commonly see, is the VCC grant scheme. Sean, can you give us an update in terms of what we've seen to date with the VCC grant scheme, feedback in the market, or just any high-level thoughts?
Sure. Thank you, Rod. I think of course, other than the redomiciliation pathway that fund managers can explore, as Brendan has explained, the other option would be to set up a new VCC from scratch in Singapore. So to promote the adoption of this framework, I think the MES has launched the grant scheme to co-fund the qualifying expenses paid to Singapore-based service providers in relation to the incorporation or registration of the VCC. So of course, some conditions would have to be met in order to be eligible for the grant. So each fund manager, licensed fund manager, has up to a maximum of 3 grants that they can apply for each successfully incorporated or redomiciled VCC. So that's 3 for each fund manager. So what does this grant cover actually? So it's actually a 70% co-funding of the expenses that is capped at 150,000 Sing dollars for each VCC. So what do these expenses include? They may be legal services that include the drafting of various legal documents such as the constitution, the info memorandum, the subscription agreement, etc., as well as tax advice or services that include tax opinions on the incorporation of the VCC, as well as tax incentive applications, which we may touch on later, the 13R, 13X, those incentive schemes, as well as administrative work or any regulatory compliance work that you need in relation to the VCC setup. So all these can be applied under the grant scheme. So some things to note about the grant. The grant cannot be claimed solely for registration of sub-funds. So under the umbrella structure, it can only be claimed for a registration of a sub-fund as part of an umbrella setup. So it must be done together. That's important to note. So it can't be done at a sub-fund level, but it has to be done on the umbrella VCC level. So, I mean, how can we go about applying for this grant? So there's an application form actually that can be found or retrieved from the MES website. So what we would need is the various documents in relation to the VCC, the incorporation documents from ACRA, the constitution, etc., as well as the invoices from the professional parties, in the VCC application for their services rendered. So, if we can collate those fees and send it in with the grant application, I think that would be quite comprehensive. So again, I must stress that the grant only covers professional fees paid to Singapore-based service providers in relation to the setup of the VCC. So that excludes any running or annual upkeep costs. So those will not be applicable to be claimed under the grant. Okay. So, how do we distribute the grant? I think that's the big question that everyone will be asking. So the grant is applied at the umbrella level, as I've mentioned, and the distribution of the grant, I think, is probably at the sole discretion of the fund manager. So they may take into consideration various circumstances or factors that may, but so it's really on a case-by-case basis, I would say. So, it's really up to the investors and the fund managers to come together to a consensus on that. So in terms of the timeline for the grant, the VCC has 3 months to submit its application for the grant from its time of incorporation or redomiciliation. And as to how long it would take for you to get the grant back from the MES, generally the industry average is about 3 months, and I think that's quite reasonable. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Sean. Actually, there was a question that came up. I'll ask you while we're on the topic of that.
Sure.
Are the 3 grants available on a per VCC basis or on a per fund manager?
Okay, so yes, so it's per fund manager. So each fund manager, each licensed fund manager has 3 grant applications. So it's not per VCC, so it's per fund manager. Okay,
perfect. That answers that question.
No problem.
Corporate governance is a critical consideration of any fund structure, and I see it's a growing trend that we see basically in the offshore world as well. And I view the VCC as no different. Martin, as you're an expert in this field, can you provide us an overview, I guess, of basically corporate governance considerations for the VCC?
Yeah, thank you, Rod. Look, I think historically, if you were certainly a hedge fund manager in Asia, you were typically looking at Cayman as your vehicle. And you know, reliance was bare. So the management and control would have to sit in Cayman for that vehicle. So therefore, if you were a manager in Asia or in Singapore, you were bearing reliance on the directors in Cayman or certainly outside of Singapore. Well, it depends on the tax incentives you have in Singapore, but in general, you know, you were looking to have your directors outside of Singapore and management and control sitting outside of Singapore. So because this is an onshore vehicle and an onshore funds, therefore management and control has to sit onshore. And how the MAS have trying to keep oversight of this is by making the fund manager one of the directors. So which is a very useful scheme. You know, it really makes sure that the fund and everybody, the parties to the fund are compliant with the various regulations within the SFA in Singapore around the regulations. So there's the retail scheme and the authorized scheme. So if we take the retail schemes or the authorized schemes as they're called, that was done. Unit trust was the traditional way of doing retail funds in Singapore. Over time, they're looking to VCC to take over from retail schemes. So therefore, a unit trust obviously had a trustee who had the fiduciary duty. So under the retail schemes or the authorized schemes for VCC, a board of directors will come in and replace a large element of that trustee role. So you need 3 directors as the board of directors on the retail scheme. And one of those directors has to be independent. So that's a shift in mindset, that a board of director versus a trustee. The day-to-day work still carries on. In the alternative space or in the restricted schemes, only one director is required, but the manager or a representative from a licensed rep from the manager must be one of those directors. So in essence, for an alternative fund, the manager can be the only director. Now, that I think from experience and from people that we know that have set up the VCCs, that's fine when it's proprietary money from the manager setting up its own fund. But we all know when you're going to look for institutional money or larger tickets that you'll have to add an independent board in there as well. So I think if for small startup funds, it's fine to only have the manager, but over time, you'll have to have independence on the board. And coincidentally, the MAS are looking at that right now as well, that they're looking at adding more directors to the board as well. So, you know, the management and control sits in Singapore, therefore the board is in Singapore. I think a lot of managers were used to the Cayman model where they relied a lot on the Cayman directors providing the governance and oversight to chair the meetings and to run that cycle as well. That will change now with the VCC. We'll have to have the meetings onshore and direct in Singapore, and you have to. There is an AGM, so it is a Singapore corporate at the end of the day. So you know you have to follow ACRA rules, which is the company's office here. So you have to have an AGM and file your financial statements with that on an annual basis. You can apply not to have an AGM 60 days from the AGM date, so you can do away with that function. So I think it's a change in mindset, Rod. I mean, you know, because the fund is onshore, the governance is onshore, and the reporting is onshore as well. So there'll be a lot more hands-on activity from the board as well.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Martin. A question that just came up. Does the independent director have to be a Singapore resident?
Yes. Sorry. The independent director.
Yes. Yeah, the independent director. Does that have to be a Singapore resident?
No. It's
okay.
only when they don't have to be. It's just when you're, again, it depends on the tax. So if you're going for 13R, 13X, etc., then you're looking for majority onshore. So you might look, you can have offshore directors, but you for tax purposes, for substance requirements, you'll be looking at majority onshore.
Okay, perfect.
Now, yeah, so then the question is, what is resident? So it goes by the tax rule. So if somebody's got an EP, they don't. So because it's a Singapore company as well, to form it, then there must be a PR or a Singaporean, but you can also be resident with an EP as well.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, I guess the question is that basically everyone should look at their composition of their board and make sure that it meets the standard requirements, either underneath taxation or for a corporate structure standpoint.
Yeah.
And run that body advisors before appointing.
Yeah. So if the manager is Singaporean, then it's fine. It ticks the boxes from all levels. So the requirement that the manager is also a director, and also from an ACRA perspective to set up the company. But then if the person is on an EP, you know, they'll have to, you know, maybe add somebody that has a higher residency standard than an EP, perhaps.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for that, Martin. Brendan, I'd like to hand over to you in terms of AML CTS, because on a global trend, we, you know, a number of changing fundamental rules, I guess, and basically the way AML CTF is applied. So in regards to the VCC, can you just give us a quick overview in terms of how that's structured in Singapore?
Yeah, I think the AML and CFT rules for the VCC doesn't really differ too much for in respect, or rather from the other similarly regulated entities under the MAS framework. So I think in terms of the key thing that has crept up or come up quite a fair bit in the course of setting up VCCs is the outsourcing of that AML function. I think if you look at the consultation paper, it's quite clear that the VCC cannot outsource the AML CFT function directly to any entity that is not similarly regulated for AML by the MAS. So what that means is that because the bulk of the fund administrators in Singapore are not regulated by the MAS, although we know that this could potentially change in the future. But as of today, you know, fund admins are mostly not regulated by the MAS. So the problem we have is that we can't have the fund outsource the AML function directly to the fund admin. And this has been an issue because typically how the fund admin agreements have been drafted is the fund will outsource it directly to the fund admin in that fund admin agreement. So, I mean, the way we've worked around this is to have the fund manager, or rather the fund itself, outsourcing that function to the fund manager in the fund management agreement, because the fund manager is a regulated entity. And then we put the fund manager as a party to the fund admin agreement and have the, just specific to the AML function itself, have the fund manager outsource that to the fund admin. So that's the current workaround. But of course, like I mentioned earlier, once the fund admin space is regulated, which could be a good thing for the industry, given the MAS seal stamp of approval, I think that problem should fall away. But yeah, I think in terms of the operational aspects of KYC and AML, probably maybe Rod or Ellen, you could chime in here, because I think that would be something that you guys would be a lot more familiar with than I am.
Yeah, of course, Brendan. Thanks, Brendan. So if you look at how AML has been done traditionally in investment funds, if you look at it from a Cayman's perspective, Cayman funds are typically contracted to a regulated fund admin, which follows the best practices of FATF. But if you consider that Singapore is also a full FATF member country, so we do follow the best practices of FATF. But the key thing is that the responsibility of AML and CFT lies with the VCC. We in turn delegate it to the fund manager. So I think MAS has clear guidelines on AML, not specific to VCC yet, but in general as an anti-money laundering guidelines is that whoever they outsource it to, the fund manager must ensure that the party that they have outsourced the AML requirements to, they need to be able to meet the minimum requirements of the fund manager, because being a regulated fund manager, they do have the minimum regulations set up by MAS in order to, of course, continue being a fund manager in Singapore itself. So if you look back into the fund admin space, most of the fund admins in Singapore are part of a bigger group of companies. So for example, Krypton, we are regulated and headquartered in Bermuda and licensed by the BMA, which in turn we do adopt the best practices that is being set up by the BMA, and also the best practices of the other jurisdictions that we work in, like Cayman, Mauritius, and so on and so forth. So fund managers as well investors can take comfort that if the fund admin actually does the AML work in the end, we do follow, they do have to abide through the fund manager's requirement, minimum AML requirement, as well as their group policy, which in the end will tie back to the best practices set up by FATF, as well as potentially MAS.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Alan. And I guess the theory I always go back to, which I say to board of directors, managers, or whoever else is, underneath a regulatory preview, is trust but verify. So you can rely on an external party. However, it's still the under obligation to verify that they are carrying out the policies and procedures and making sure that basically the AML CTF requirements are met from the fund structure standpoint. So I think.
Yeah, just add something to the AML. There was a lot of confusion in the market about this delegation of AML by the manager for a VCC. So there was a bit of uncertainty about, so if the manager had a VCC, they're responsible for the AML. There was some noise in the market that if they delegated that role, then that party would have to be regulated as well. So as the guy said, typically a fund manager will delegate the AML KYC process to a fund administrator. And as Brandon said, fund admins aren't regulated in Singapore. So everybody was panicking, going, oh, if I have to support the fund manager, then I need to be regulated for AML as well. So that wasn't the case. So it still carries on the same. So the fund manager, if it delegates the AML to a fund admin, that's only the collection process of KYC and collecting passports and subscription documents. That still carries on. The only time that the other party needs to be regulated is if the manager doesn't want to be responsible for the AML. Now, if the manager wants to delegate the responsibility, that other party has to be regulated. But in reality, who in their right mind would put up their hand to take that, right? Because you're ultimately responsible.
Yeah.
So in reality, there is not much change. The manager is still responsible. The fund admin is still responsible for collecting the information.
Yeah.
Unless the manager wants to delegate the responsibility.
Yeah, I think just to sort of clarify, in the follow-on to the consultation, part 2 of the consultation, MAS did clarify that you can't directly outsource it to a non-regulated entity, but you can the regulated entity to which it's being outsourced to can outsource that to a non-regulated entity, and that's how you're able to get the fund admin involved. But I think Martin is right in the sense that ultimately the responsibility still lies with the fund. And it's invariably the case that you will have an indemnity provision in the fund admin agreement, where the fund administrator is indemnified for any losses in connection with the services they are providing for AML and CFT. So I think that's the industry norm from what I've seen so far.
Yeah, I totally agree with Brandon and what Brandon and Martin said. So RFO being a licensed fund manager, we do have a minimum requirement for AML and CFT that we have to meet. So we do not delegate those procedures to anyone. We work with fund administrators like Krypton or the like to perform these AML and CFT duties. But I think overall, the fund manager has a responsibility to retain such procedures for the fund. I think that's important to note.
Perfect, thank you all. So I guess moving on to the next topic, the growth that we've seen in the VCCs, there's been a number of strategies which we talked about in structuring. Sean, can you provide us an overview, I guess, of the uses of the VCC and what we've seen in the market today, or where we expect the VCC to go?
Sure, thanks, Rod. I think for us at RFO, we wear many hats. As a multifamily office, our main role is to act as gatekeepers or wealth managers for our clients. So our function is independent to that of the banks or brokers. So we stand on our client's side. Through the use of a multifamily platform like us, we are able to consolidate and manage the entire pool of our clients' assets holistically and more efficiently. So this allows us to specifically adjust different asset allocations and design structures to provide maximum value to each individual client. So as I've mentioned, RFO will act as a licensed fund manager in the case of the VCC. So I think as a company, we envision that the VCC will act as a wonderful complement to the existing platform that we have in place. So as mentioned earlier, one of the major benefits of the VCC is its flexibility of how it can be structured in a number of ways, depending on the needs of the fund and its investors. So the VCC's ability to be set up in an umbrella structure allows for both consolidation and segregation of assets under a single legal entity. So for example, a family's assets can be consolidated at the umbrella level and divided into various sub-funds to be managed by a different family member or through different investment strategies. So that's something that we commonly see. Previous fund structures that were commonly used in Singapore, include the limited partnership, unit trust, as Martin has mentioned previously. So many of those restrictions have been removed in the new VCC framework, and that allows for greater flexibility and structuring options for investors that are looking to domicile their funds in Singapore. So the VCC is suitable for a wide range of investment products. That is really by design. So that allows fund managers like us to greater room to maneuver in terms of investment strategies and whatnot. So both open-ended, closed-ended, traditional investments, alternative investments, they're all suitable to be launched through the use of the VCC through different structures. So previously, the sub-fund structure was not possible in Singapore, and fund managers had to set up a brand new sub-funds for each strategy, which was quite, I think, inefficient, I would say. So that being said, with the new sub-fund structure, investor protection is also one of the key concerns when I think the MAS drafted the VCC Act. So fortunately, the assets and liabilities of each sub-fund are legally segregated from one another under the Act. So that provides for quite a bit of protection. Also, the register of shareholders for the VCC will not be made available to the public, unlike previously on the Companies Act. So the register of the shareholders will only be made known to the regulators. So I think it is important to note that, of course, the board of directors have the duty to ensure that there's adequate checks and balances in place for the VCC operations. And one more great point that I think the VCC can bring to investors is that it has access to the tax treaties and the double taxation agreements with other jurisdictions worldwide, and as well as the tax incentive schemes, the 13R, 13X, that can also be applied to the VCC. So therefore, I think the VCC allows for tax and operational efficiency when it comes to investment management moving forward in Singapore. I think that's quite exciting for us.
Perfect. Thank you, Sean. Just in regards to 13R, 13X, I guess, is there anyone on the panel just want to give a quick overview of those two tax components?
Maybe I can drop in over here. So I think the main difference between 13R and 13X is the AUM requirement. So 13X requires at the point in time of the application that the fund have at least 50 million in assets under management. 13R doesn't have that requirement, but it has certain restrictions on local non-individual shareholding. So what that means is that if you have a corporate shareholder that has 50%, owns 50% of the economic interest of the fund, that is something that 13R doesn't allow. It's not to say that, I think if you have a person owning 50% of the economic interest, that person will be penalized by IRAS. So sort of like erodes the tax benefit. And one of the key requirements also is the expenses requirement. There's a slight technical difference between 13X and 13R if you read the plain language of the requirement. 13X requires 200,000 in local business spend annually, and 13R requires 200,000 in business expenses annually. The missing word is local. So, but I think in terms of VCC, the main benefit of the VCC in respect of the tax exemptions is the aggregation component. So if you have a fund that is 20 million and you have two other sub-funds that are each 20 million, on a standalone basis, they may not meet the 15 million requirement of 13X. But at the umbrella level, which is where you apply for the exemption, 20 times 3 is 60, right? So they still fulfill the requirement. Same thing for the 200K spend. Theoretically, if each individual sub-fund spends 70 or 80,000 a year, as a standalone, they don't fulfill the requirements, but on an aggregated basis, they do cross the 200K mark. So I think in terms of economies of scale, that's what the VCC provides. And I guess also the other thing that I think there is a theory. I think maybe I just point out one of the discrepancy in the practice of certain tax advisors that I've seen in the market. Because once you apply for 13X, you will have to provide your strategy to the MAS. And once that is approved, you can't change the strategy unless you get approval from MAS. So when you have a platform, an umbrella platform with multiple sub-funds, all of which are not related to one another, then the question is, how do you draft the strategy in the main PPM? What would be ideal would be to just say that the strategy for each sub-fund will be as provided in the supplement of that sub-fund, right? But obviously, I think there are some tax advisors that say that this might not, be sufficient for the purposes of the application. Although on the flip side, we've also seen some applications going through where the strategy has been drafted this way. But yeah, so just to point out some of the things that we've seen so far with respect to,
Yeah, thanks, Brandon. Rod, I still talk to people about VCC and they think it's automatically tax-free.
Yeah.
So there is a misunderstanding in the market that VCC has some kind of separate tax incentive. I get the question quite regularly. You still have to apply for the tax incentives under 13 or 13X for the VCC itself. There's still a lot of people think that because it's a VC, it's automatically tax-free. It's not. The tax incentives haven't changed. So you still have to apply for 13 or 13X, which comes up a lot in conversations, actually. Okay,
perfect. Thank you for that, Martin. I guess looking at the next operational question that we see a fair bit, and I guess with some misconception in the market, it was on performance fees, equalization versus series. Brandon, can I get you to take that topic?
Yeah, sure. So I guess I'll start for the benefit of those who are not familiar. I think equalization and series accounting is just basically two fairly mainstream accounting methodologies in the alternative investment funds industry. So without going into too much technical detail, both methods are basically aimed at ensuring that the performance fee attributable to an investor or a group of investors is correctly assessed. And equalization uses what we call a deficit or premium adjustment to equalize the difference between the NAV per share and the high watermark, right? Whereas series accounting basically just tracks the performance fee that is attributable to an investor or group of investors through the issuance of series, in the class of participating shares. Well, what we've seen so far is that there is a view in the industry that posits that the current version of the VCC Act only allows for equalization and not series accounting. This is presumably because under the VCC Act, shares have to be issued and redeemed at NAV. And when you talk about series accounting, each series is typically issued at the same price as the original price. Well, I can see the logic to this, but I would rather take the more commercially palatable view, actually, that series accounting is actually allowed under the VCC Act. Because in my view, the NAV per share of each series actually will be tracked separately. And so when there's a redemption request, for example, the NAV of the specific series will be the basis for computing that redemption price. I think that is sort of the technical side of it. But if you look at it from a higher level policy perspective, I think the fact that the VCC is meant to be a fairly flexible vehicle, and the fact also that these two accounting methodologies are fairly standard industry norms in other parts of the world. And if the VCC or MAS intended for the VCC to be a vehicle that competes with other fund domiciles in the world, I don't think the MAS intended to be prescriptive or restrictively prescriptive about the type of accounting methodology that a fund can adopt. So I actually personally think that both are okay. In fact, a lot of, from what I hear from my clients, the accounting software out there are more tuned to facilitating series accounting rather than equalization. So I would actually think that series is more the industry norm than equalization, or at least the preferred accounting methodology. But of course, Ellen and Rod can chime in based on your experience as fund administrators.
Yeah, from a global perspective, what we tend to see, besides the U.S. partnership approach, we tend to see series as more dominating the equalization methodology of choice. Credit equalization or equalization is still used in Europe, however, not as prevalent as what we see in the series methodology.
Yeah, I guess just as something that is unique to the VCC on series is allowed. The constitutions are flexible enough to allow you to do it, and you define your offering within the offering document itself. But if it is series, you can only issue the series at NAV. In other jurisdictions, you can issue a new series at $100 or $1,000 and issue contract notes quite quickly after month end. But under VCC, you're not allowed to do that. It has to be at NAV. So that's something that's slightly different than other jurisdictions, Ron.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for that, Martin. In the interest of keeping things moving, I guess I got two other topics I'd like to cover off quickly. Martin, and I'll go back to you quickly on this one first in regards to what are your thoughts on the next milestones for VCC? You know, clearly has been quite successful to date. I guess, what are your thoughts on where we see the VCC market moving, I guess, the next 6 months or even over the next 2 or 3 years?
Yeah, look, people are saying that Cayman is dead and, you know, Singapore is going to take over from Cayman and all that sort of stuff. Look, VCC is an option now for people at least. You know, historically, if you're looking at a hedge fund with tax, you know, incentives and things like that, you're typically looking at Cayman. But at least now in Singapore, you can look at, if your assets are in Asia and your investors are in Asia, Singapore now is a viable option for you. So I do think that for the smaller managers with Asian focus, VCC will probably be stronger than Cayman on a long-term basis. I think, you know, as it's relatively new, it's only 6 months old, you know, trying to educate global managers about VCC, you know, if it's a global offering, then Cayman is sort of the tried and tested route for the big managers globally. So it'll be hard to that at a certain amount of inertia, right? It depends on where your investor base is as well, Rod. I mean, if you're trying to target Europe or US, right? So, but at least it's a good option. I think as well as then once, you know, from the retail schemes, from a distribution play, once Singapore signs up for ARFP, the Asia Regional Funds Passport Regime, then you'll see more managers in the retail space in Singapore opting for VCC as well, because there'll be a mutual recognition scheme across Asia for retail VCC funds as well. So I think, you know, by and large, I think it's very positive news. And also trying to distribute Cayman products in certain locations has become quite tough as well. So from a distribution play, VCC makes a lot of sense. And we have people from outside Singapore looking at Singapore. For example, Australia, if an Australian is trying to set up a Cayman fund, it's got a negative connotation in Australia, whereas a VCC is quite more attractive. We have people from Philippines, we've got people from Hong Kong. Obviously, with the issues in Hong Kong, people are looking at Singapore as well. So, you know, there's a lot to go on, but it's all positive.
Okay, you kind of led into my second question that I wanted to cover off. So it's kind of great that you covered that off. That's the distribution of the VCC. And I guess, you know, one of the things I see is ensuring that a domicile or basically a fund jurisdiction choice is appealing. I guess, how has the global investors been seeing the VCC? You know, have we been seeing investors outside of Asia look into these structures? I think you just mentioned Switzerland, for example, looking at it, or Australia. You know, are there any other markets or any other investors that we've been seeing on this on a global scale?
Yeah, look, the VCC ticks the box for a lot of US investors because you can use US GAAP. It's got the tick the box exercise for tax reporting. So there's got a couple of features in there which are quite useful. I think American investors are used to LPs. So, you know, VCC being an LTD, there'll be certain milestones needed there. We have one client who's putting a Singapore LP on top just to help the US investors. It's not needed, but it's to use to help the US investors as well. So, yeah, so let's see. I think for the large managers globally, it's a good solution, but it's not the end solution. Yeah. So we're seeing some managers looking at certain places which are difficult, like Korea, let's say. And Singapore has a very good double tax treaty with Korea and Japan, particularly in the, you know, the double tax treaty space with some countries. VCC might make sense.
Okay, oh, that's great news. So I guess now we'll turn it over to questions. So what I'd like to do is, for anyone that's attending the webinar today, please feel free to ask any questions. And what I'll do is try to sort these out and go through and ask the panelists various questions. As a reminder, any questions that are not answered during this webinar today, what we'll do is basically summarize those in a document and circulate it to all parties that are attending. So looking at the questions right now, the first question, I guess, and I'll put this as an open-ended question so anyone can jump in. Within one sub-fund, is it possible to have two strategies? For example, I know in some Cayman structures, we can have one fund that has two share classes underneath the same fund. So looking at the VCC, within a sub-fund, is it possible to have two classes of shares with two different strategies?
Yep, I think I'll just take this. So so the best practice is always to, while it is technically possible to have two strategies in a single sub fund, I think what we need to note is that there is no constitutional segregation and ring fencing of assets and liabilities. So I mean, if you put it in perspective, if share class A invests in listed products and share class B invests in private products, so if touch wood, if unfortunately one of the share class goes insolvent, the creditors can actually reach out and use the assets of the other share class to meet its insolvency needs as well. So so my answer is, it's not technically impossible. I think it's more of investors of the other share class and strategy, the risk of actually losing assets over a strategy that they are not participating in. Brendan or Martin or Sean, do you want to add on to that?
No, I agree with Alan. In fact, we've also been asked whether we can have an umbrella that's both open, that caters to both open end and closed end. I mean, technically, yes, the documents will be a bit more complicated because the fundamental difference between open end and closed end fund is just the redemptions, right? Whether you can redeem or not. So technically possible, but I think you need to figure out. I think the most important question has already been covered by Alan, whether there's effective segregation of assets and liabilities if you do it within one sub fund. If it's intra sub fund or inter sub fund, I think you still get the benefit of segregation. But if it's intra sub fund, that means within the sub fund itself, then yes, that issue arises.
Yeah, I think if it's within a sub fund itself, it will get really messy. I mean, especially if the strategies are completely in two different directions, and the investors are different groups of people in some cases. So if it's proprietary money, maybe you can have a think about it. But I would suggest if you have two different strategies, then use two different sub funds. I think that's the most straightforward and the most efficient way to look at it.
Yeah, and I think that's the beauty of the VCC with the umbrella structure, that it allows the easily set up of each of these sub funds. So I don't know why you would try to overcomplicate the structure with basically having two classes within an underlying sub.
Exactly.
So,
yep.
Comments. Kind of a different question on the same topic, actually, when we look at structuring, and the question is talking about, you know, basically open-ended and closed-ended, I guess, you know, within underneath one umbrella company. Brandon, you kind of touched on this. You know, underneath one umbrella company, can you have open-ended and closed-end mandates within the same structure? And I guess the answer is yes, but it could be quite complex in documentation. So any feedback on that or any recommendations to the group?
I think this is more of an operational issue because the fund admin also has to be comfortable with the fact that the platform enables both open-ended and closed-ended strategies or funds. But like you said, or you pointed out earlier, from a legal documentational perspective, it will be a bit more cumbersome, but it's not technically inachievable. But yeah, I guess maybe from the fund admin perspective, is there any operational difficulties with having a fund that is set up for both open and closed?
No, I mean, to be honest, when we look at historically, we look at a Cayman SPC. We administer each segregated portfolio as if it's a separate fund by itself. I think the biggest struggle, I think, would be, and the most cumbersome part would be the legal documentations, because in the end, all of these sub funds, they do have to follow the master PPM or the info memo, which has the bulk of the general information. So that could be the biggest hurdle to cross in terms of documenting and protecting the interests of both strategies, both open and closed-ended strategies within this whole.
Yeah, I think, look, whether it's a Singapore SPC or a Cayman SPC, a lot of the problems are common, but, you know, there are some realities with mixing hedge strategy with private equity strategies. Under VCC, the sub-funds must all have the same financial year end, which is fine. But let's say you have one sub-fund that has to file with CFTC, and then you have another sub-fund that is private equity. So you have to have your audits done at the same time. There could be some practical issues by having hedge and private equity and real estate in the same portfolios, which may not be apparent at the time, but it would always be, look, if it's proprietary money and you know, there's not too many investors, it could be okay, but on a long-term basis, you're going to have problems mechanically, I think.
Okay. Perfect. Another quick question here I'll put open to the group. May I ask, how often do we need to update the shareholders information for VCC? I'm not sure if that's in regards to basically AML CTF, but I think that's the direction that it's coming from in regards to updating the shareholder information for VCC.
I mean, because so the share register is not on ACRA anymore, so that is, so it's not a public register anymore. Someone needs to hold that register. It can be the administrator as well. But anytime there's a subscription and a redemption, then you have to update the register. If it's an AML question, then that's standard Singapore AML law, right? So, and if you've high, low, or medium risk investors, how you quantify that. So I'm not too sure if it's the share reg or an AML question that the person wanted.
Okay, so I guess what I'll do, just for the matter of housekeeping, I guess, you know, if anyone has any questions post this here webinar, please feel free to send them in. If we need to do any clarity on terms of the questions, we can definitely ask those as well and just basically redefine that. We'll circulate any questions out to basically all the participants of today's panel, just as a FAQ, frequently asked questions. So before we wrap up, I guess there's one other question here I'll ask. And the question is on the double tax treaty for the VCC for South Korea. Martin, can you just touch base on that quickly again? I guess, and that was in regards to Japan, South Korea.
Yeah, look, we have some, particularly with private equity, when you're exiting a deal in Japan and Korea, there's withholding tax when you exit those locations. So with a VCC, because of the double tax treaties in Singapore, those withholding taxes go away, and then other taxes like interest income or dividend income or expense or income can be mitigated as well. So it's pretty standard double tax treaty stuff with Korea and Japan. But the VCC, because you're onshore in Singapore, then there's less justification needed for that.
Perfect. Thank you, Martin. So I guess I'd just like to close off today's webinar, I guess, and just give everyone on the panel a chance to basically add any topic or just any quick comments that people should consider in regards to structuring VCCs or just in regards to VCC in general, what we covered today. Again, anyone has any questions, please feel free to circulate them. What we'll do is make available a copy of this recording as well as any frequently asked questions post, probably a couple days following. So feel free to send in questions after this event as well. You can send them to myself or Alan or anyone on this panel as well. So any closing thoughts from everyone on the panel? Perfect. Okay.
I think we should say that. No, thank you. Look, just thank you to Rod and Alan and the team and the panelists for coming on. It's great to share the experiences with us. We had a successful 6 months, and as you said, Rod, anybody on the webinar, feel free to reach out to us. We're more than happy to talk to them.
Yep.
I think, you know, based on the success we've seen to date, I think we'll probably end up looking at probably doing another follow-up in 6 months' time just to recap developments and everything else, because I think, you know, the Singapore VCC with the strength to date will definitely see this as a going concern in the market in regards to basically a viable option. Even we'll see how it develops, whether it just stays as a regional option or whether it becomes a global option. I think, you know, there's still a lot of groundwork to be done, but I think there's been great strides made to date. And we look forward to seeing how the VCC continues in the future.
Absolutely.
Great.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you all for your time. And with that, we'll close the webinar.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Bye.